Hello year one, it's Miss Drage here. So our new topic for this term is all about amazing authors. And as you can see on the screen, the amazing author that we are focusing on this term is Roald Dahl. Got the story here as well. Okay, so we're going to be reading George's Marvellous Medicine. The characters in this story, and there aren't many of them, there's George Cankle, Mr. Kelly Cankle, who's the dad, Mrs. Cankle, the mum, and Grandma. Okay, let's see what George gets up to in George's Marvellous Medicine. This is chapter 1. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning, so be a good boy and don't get up to any mischief. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he could get up to. Mischief is being a bit naughty. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, the mother said. Then out she went, closing the back door behind her. Grandma was dozing in her chair by the window, opening one wicked little eye, and said, Now you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine. No, Grandma, George said. And just try to behave yourself for once while she's away. Yes, Grandma, George said. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and on the farm they lived. It was miles away from anywhere, so there were never any children to play with. He was tired at staring at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as that grisly old Grunham of a grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting thing to spend a Saturday morning. You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start, Grandma said to George. That'll keep you out of mischief for a few moments. Yes, Grandma, said George. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small, puckered-up mouth like a dog's bottom. How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma? George asked. 1 spoon and no milk, she said. Most grandmothers are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day and every day sitting in her chair by the window, and she was always complaining, grousing, grouching, grumbling, gribbling about something or other. Never once, ever on her best day had she smiled at George and said, Why don't you have a game of snakes and ladders? Or, why don't you have a lovely morning? Or, how was school today? She didn't seem to care about other people, only herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. It's not sweet enough, she said. Put more sugar in. George took the cup back to the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carried it carefully into Grandma. Where's the saucer? She said. I don't want a cup without a saucer. George fetched a saucer. And what about my teaspoon, if you please? I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well. I'll stir my own tea, thank you very much, she said. Fetch me a teaspoon. George fetched a teaspoon. When George's mother or father were home, Grandma would never order George about like this. It was only when he was on his own that she began treating him badly. You know what the matter is with you, the old woman said, staring at George over the rim of the teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy. But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma, George said. Of course you can, she snapped. Growing is a nasty, childish habit. But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't grow, we'd never be grown-ups. Rubbish, boy, rubbish, she said. Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not. But you did once, Grandma. Only once. And only very little, the old woman answered. I gave growing up when I was extremely small, along with all the other nasty childish habits and like laziness and disobedience and greed and slobbiness and untidiness and stupidness. You haven't given up any of those, have you? I'm still only a little boy, Grandma. You're 8 years old, she snorted. That's old enough to know better. If you stop growing soon, it'll be too late. Too late for what, Grandma? It's ridiculous, she said. You're nearly as tall as me already. George took a look at Grandma. She certainly wasn't a very tiny person. Her legs were so short that she had to have a footstool to put her feet on. Her head only came halfway up the back of the armchair. Daddy says it's fine for a man to be tall, George said. Don't listen to your daddy, Grandma said. Listen to me. But how do I stop myself growing? George asked. Eat less chocolate, Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow? It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea, but never took her eyes from the tiny little boy who stood before her. Never grow up, she said. Always down. Yes, Grandma. And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. Cabbage? Oh, no, I don't like cabbage, George said. It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's got caterpillars in it, so much the better. Ugh, George said. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said. Mummy washes them down the sink, George said. Mummy's silly as you are, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs, too. Not slugs, cried George. I couldn't eat slugs. Whenever I see a live slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up quite before it crawls away. Delicious! She squeezed her lips together tight so that her mouth became a tiny wrinkly hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you. You're joking, Grandma. I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all. There you go. Crunch. Grandma, that's beastly. The old hag grinned, showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, she said, you get a beetle inside the stem of a stick of celery. That's what I like. Grandma, how could you? You find all sorts of nice things in sticks of raw celery, the old woman went on. Sometimes it's earwigs." "I don't want to hear about it," cried George. "A big fat earwig is very tasty," Grandma said, licking her lips. "But you've got to be very quick, my dear. When you put one of those in your mouth, it has a pair of sharp nippers on its back end, and if it grabs your tongue with those, it never lets go. So you've got to bite the earwig first, chomp, chomp, before it bites you." George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get away as soon as possible and far away from this filthy old woman. "You're trying to get away from me, aren't you?" she said, pointing a finger straight at George's face. "You're trying to get away from your grandma." Little George stood by the door, staring at the old hag in the chair. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He had always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he was not so sure. "Come closer to me, little boy," she said, beckoning to him with a horny finger. "Come closer to me and I will tell you my secrets." George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. "I know a great many secrets," she said, and suddenly she smiled with a thin, icy smile, the kind a snake might just make before it bites you. "Come over here to Grandma," she whispered, "and I'll whisper you my secrets." George took a step backwards, edging closer and closer to the door. "You mustn't be frightened of your old grandma," she said, smiling that icy smile. George took another step backwards. Can you see? George and Grandma talking. She doesn't sound like a very nice character. "Some of us," she said, and all at once she was leaning forward in her chair and whispering a throaty voice to George had never heard used before. "Some of us," she said, "have magical powers that can twist the creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes." A tingle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine. He began to feel frightened. "Some of us," the old woman went on, "have fire in our tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry in the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that make your hairs stand right up on end and your eyes pop out of your sockets." George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. "We know how to make your nails drop off and teeth grow out of your fingers instead." George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him the most of all, the frosty smile, the brilliant and blinking eyes. "We know how to make you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you." "Grandma," he cried, "stop!" "We know secrets, my dear, about dark places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other." George made a dive for the door. "It doesn't matter how far you run," he heard her saying. "You won't get away." George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. I don't think George feels very safe with Grandma. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 1.